That made 6 submarines lost in a little more than 6 weeks. Fate allowed HMS Jupiter and USS Edsall no more chances at us. Both went to the bottom before the middle of March, along with nearly all the naval strength that the Allies sent into the Malay Barrier area. Meanwhile, I-17 was getting ready to make coastal residents of America scream, "Where is our Navy?" In Tokyo, orders were being passed from the red brick building of our Navy Ministry to Combined Fleet for a special operation. These orders, relayed to 6th Fleet Headquarters and to land-based naval aircraft commands, would give Americans at Pearl Harbor something new to think and worry about. It would be called the K Operation. Chapter 4. Shells on Santa Barbara. More bombs on Pearl Harbor. Sea Dr. Kozo Nishino had command of I-17 at the time, Vice ADM. Shimizu ordered all submarines at Kwajalein to chase and sink the American task force. Nishino pursued almost as far as Oahu, then continued to the U.S. West Coast, where his gun crew shelled an oil storage field at Elwood City, near Santa Barbara, California. The diary of Seaman Genji Hara, radio operator serving with Nishino, has survived. Here are some excerpts from it. February 21. I-17 is once more operating off the coast of America, but this time we are alone. Our movements have been slow, and the sea ripples softly along the sides of our ship. The vast spread of the Pacific seems like a watery waste to me. Wireless reception from the 6th Fleet Communications Tower on Kwajalein was very good today, but I could not hear much of what I-23 was sending. She is in the Hawaiian area and must be having trouble with her transmission equipment. Around midnight I heard a lookout reporting a lighthouse off to port, but by 0100 it was discovered to be a light from an enemy small craft. It could have been a fishing boat, but the captain thought it might be a patrol boat. We increased speed and rapidly moved away from it. After getting off watch I slept a while, but was awakened at 200 with the order, "Stand by to submerge." The voice on the loudspeaker circuit said, "There may be an enemy patrol boat following us. All hands rig for depth charge attack." Then I-17 dipped silently beneath the surface, where we cut off all unnecessary machinery. The only noise I could hear came from the hum of our sound detection equipment. Nothing happened. After a while, we surfaced. I went back to the radio room and found that some messages that had arrived earlier had been decoded. They listed the places that I-17, together with other submarines, were to bombard and others, like San Diego, we were to avoid. I felt a thrill, as though we would really carry out the task this time and not have it cancelled, as it had been in December. February 24. After surfacing, Captain Nishino told the crew of his plans. "We are now entering Santa Barbara Strait," he said. "We will lie submerged tomorrow, doing reconnaissance with our periscope. Then, tomorrow night, we will surface after dark and bombard the Elwood oil field, inside the strait." "We are really going to do it this time," I told myself. As a substitute gunner in case a gun crew member was injured or killed, I had to check over our deck weapon. About 30 knots of wind was blowing over the deck while we did it, and there were plenty of white caps on the waves. There was a dull half-moon with a hazy halo about it. I looked up into the sky and located Great Bear and the Northern Star. Then I tried to estimate the direction of Japan from where I stood. In that moment I hoped that if I died, the people back home would know that I-17 had reached out 4,000 miles to strike at America for them. I felt very warm and full of sentiment at that moment. February 25. Today I was fascinated by sounds Seaman Nagashima was picking up on our sound equipment. "Iruka!" he called out suddenly, and those of us in the room listened to the bleating noises similar to the crying Iruka fish off Kyushu near home. Then we settled down into silence, everyone probably thinking the same thing as I. We will bombard. The enemy will return our fire. We will run away to escape. They will come after us. Lunch was canned inari sushi, vinegared rice wrapped in thin fried bean curd. All hands waited anxiously for the order to battle surface. Someone passing my station while coming down from the conning tower said, "Land is in sight." Then I-17 changed course and, at a slow pace, began navigating blindly through Santa Barbara Strait, not even showing its periscope for fear of making a telltale spray. I tried to calm down by reading a book, but couldn't. I had finally decided to try to eat something, to distract my mind when the word was passed, "All hands to battle stations." It was then about 5:30 p.m. 10 minutes later, Captain Nishino ordered battle surface, "Man the deck gun." The gun captain had assembled his crew near the hatch earlier. They went on deck. Captain Nishino kept calling out, asking the distance to land and the submarine's depth, giving instructions about the targets. He ordered that shells be fired only at oil tanks. Only the gunners were on deck. The rest of us in our windowless barracks could only listen and imagine what it was like above from the sounds and shocks that came through the hull. 1, 2, 3. We could imagine the gunners loading each of those rounds, the trainer and the pointer trying to sight on the target. We had counted up to 17 when the shooting suddenly stopped. Petty Officer Homer and I had the radio watch. We spun our receiver dials, trying to find some indication of American reaction. There was none. We heard no alarm or call for help. The California radio station programs continued as leisurely as before. Gunners dropped through the hatch and I-17 began picking up speed. 2 of the crew, Onodera and Nagata, came into the radio room. "What did we hit?" I asked them. "I don't know," Onodera said. "I only saw flashes. I had no time to confirm anything." Nagara said it was beautiful and that he could see automobile headlights. The navigator came into the radio room then. "We started shelling right after sunset," he said. There was no reply until we started speeding away. Some enemy planes dropped flares, but they were far from our position. The reaction set in then. "We are the first to bombard America," everyone began telling one another. "Even if we didn't hit a thing, they know I-17 has been here." All of us felt like heroes. It was a feeling I-17's crew had earned. Newspapers in California carried panic headlines and stories about the shelling by a Jap U-boat. Demands were made on the American government to protect the coast with its navy. For 17 rounds of ammunition, Nishino's men cost the U.S. Navy many millions of dollars in time, money, ships, and men, providing escort. 3 years would pass before West Coast waters were considered safe from our attacks. Less than 2 weeks after I-17's bold feat of shelling the American coastline, a feat comparable to that of the great John Paul Jones's raiding of the English coastline generations before, our 6th Fleet submarines helped embarrass the U.S. Navy again. This action, titled K-Operation, was planned in Tokyo during January 1942, then passed to Admiral Yamato for execution. The Japanese Navy would attack Pearl Harbor again. 2 giant 4-engined flying boats were to be used. These massive patrol planes could fly nearly across the Pacific Ocean non-stop, each bearing 1 ton of bombs. Not very much explosives, but if they could be dropped on the American base, it would shake the morale of the Americans. Or so it was thought. Some writers have said that a story in the Saturday Evening Post before the war inspired the K-Operation. I don't know if this is true, but it was a most imaginative idea that required much planning and careful execution. 7 of our 6th Fleet submarines were to take part, providing support for these 2 bombers. The bombers would fly from Japan to Woche, in the Marshalls, where submarine crewmen were training in the technique of refueling aircraft from their boats. On a designated day, the planes would take off from the lagoon at Woche and fly to French frigate Shoals, over 1,600 miles away in the northwest portion of the Hawaiian Islands chain. One of our submarines, I-9, would take station halfway along this route and provide a radio beacon to guide the bombers on their way. French frigate Shoals is a small outcropping just barely rising above the sea, about 500 miles northwest of Oahu. It is far enough away from Pearl Harbor that the enemy neglected it, knowing it was too small for us to base aircraft there or to be used as an airbase by them. It did have a navigable lagoon, though, and that's all that the K operation needed. My old boat, I-15, together with I-19 and I-26, had their aircraft removed, and the hangar space was used for storing a massive amount of aviation gasoline. These 3 boats were to head for French frigate shoals and wait for the 2 flying boats. The amphibians would be refueled to capacity and take off again, swinging southeast to Pearl Harbor. A long dock on the shore opposite the south side of Ford Island was to be the aiming point for the plane's bombs. Their arrival over Pearl Harbor was timed for after midnight, as the enemy's capability for night fighting was considered very poor. The bombers would make one pass, dropping their bombs, and then head back for Watje, non-stop. A 5th submarine, I-25, would be standing by south of Pearl Harbor for air-sea rescue, a use to which our subs were put long before the Americans thought of it. Another pair of submarines were to be deployed as radio beacons along the southern route home. Sea Dr. Akiosbi Fuji's I-9 and Sea Dr. Junichi Shibata's I-23 were given their K operation instructions by wireless on February 14, so they would have time to take stations by March L. Fuji acknowledged, and carried out his assignment. Shibata also acknowledged, on February 14, but nothing was heard from him after that. I assume that I-23 was lost operationally sometime later. Submarine crewmen get tired and bored and weary and sleepy. The peak efficiency they reach after months of training falls off during weeks of hard patrolling, sometimes only just long enough for a vital valve to be left open or the wrong control wheel turned. It happened to American submarines during the war, and it happened to ours. Boats disappeared without a trace, although no combat log of either Japan or America reported any attack on them. The flying boats arrived in the Marshalls in mid-February. They made practice refuelings and short flights. I-19's aircraft made a reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor on Feb. 23, the second such flight over the island fortress since Dexter 7, 1941. Then I-19 made for French frigate shoals. On March 3, 1942, the 2 planes took off on their historic flight at about 3:30 a.m. They landed at French frigate shoals 13 hours later. I-15 and I-19 were in the lagoon, waiting. Their crews gave the 2 aircraft a great drink of fuel, and the amphibians were away again 3 hours after that, arriving over Oahu about 1 a.m. They were detected by radar, just as the planes originally attacking Pearl Harbor on Dexter 7 had been, but our planes once more got above the island without opposition. Up to that point, all had gone off without a hitch. Then the weather took a hand, something that might not have happened had Kwajalein heard from I-23, which was supposed to be providing weather reports. Our pilots found a low overcast obscuring their target. Flying blind, each pilot tried to get his bearings from a landmark and calculate where the long dock, called 1010 by the US Navy, was. This didn't work, so the pair dropped their bombs anyway, just to let the enemy know that Japanese planes had been overhid again. Both arrived safely home after a flight that covered 4,000 miles and took 24 hours to complete. One load of bombs fell harmlessly into the sea. The other landed far from Pearl Harbor, to the east of downtown Honolulu. It caused consternation among the public, who blamed the American military for carelessness. The American military put the blame on one another, with Army pilots accusing Navy pilots of jettisoning bombs without watching where they went, and vice versa. It was not until bomb fragments were found and identified that the truth came out. Our K operation has been criticized by writers as having no effect on the war. I think of it as indicating the kind of spirit that prevailed among Japanese leaders at the time. Hong Kong, Manila, Singapore, and Java were in our hands, as were Wake, Guam, and portions of the Philippines. Our ships and planes were scoring one victory after another. Our high command felt very confident and willing to try anything that would keep the enemy off balance and worried. I was starting the commanding officer's submarine course at Kure and enjoying the only home life I would know for a long time when the Java Sea battle was fought. A mixed force of British, Dutch, American and Australian ships under the Netherlands, Admiral Karel Doorman, tried to stop our invasion convoy headed for Java. Our covering force nearly wiped out the Allied force, mainly through the use of the above-water counterpart of the torpedo carried in our submarines. Named the Model 93, it had been first tested in 1933 and was kept completely secret from all foreigners. It would remain secret until 1945, although I understand that Americans obtained one during the middle of the war without realizing its speed and power. March and April were fairly good months for the Japanese submarine fleet. Our boats did well in the Indian Ocean and Java Sea, as well as on the east and west coasts of Australia. On March 16th, the wounded and ailing Shimizu was relieved as Commander 6th Fleet by Vice Admiral Teruhisa Komatsu. In April, it was declared formal policy to have our submarines operate chiefly against enemy merchantmen instead of against warships. This was pleasing news to us at submarine school. We thought the anti-merchant effort a much better use of submarines and kept pointing to Germany as an example. Our new plan to throw a blockade around Allied holdings in the Pacific Indian Ocean areas might seem overly ambitious, and one look at a chart of that part of the world might at first prove dismaying. But a closer look would show the enemy held only a few worthwhile ports in early 1942, mostly in Australia and India. Covering the Cape of Good Hope and the exits from the Suez Canal sufficiently should cut the flow of goods from the west. And we were to have the help of some German submarines in doing that. American supplies could land at only a few places in New Zealand, New Caledonia and Australia when coming from the east. With Truk and Rabaul as bases, our submarines could easily be deployed across shipping routes. Besides our submarine effort, plans were being made to move into bases in the southeastern Solomons. From there, sea- and land-based aircraft could keep an eye on the southern seas, assisting us. For these purposes, submarines began returning to Japan for refit and overhaul. I-25 got back to Yokosuka after having sent Warrant Officer Fujita's plane over a number of enemy anchorages. Subrons 4, 5 and 6 were ordered back from southwestern waters, and some of its boats were earmarked for withdrawal from active combat service. They were to be assigned as training boats in the inland sea for men who would man the new submarines to be commissioned. While I was at Kure, trying with fellow students to work out the best methods possible of employing the submarines we would all command, our southern forces rolled steadily onward. On March 15th, General Douglas MacArthur told his unit commanders, "Help is on the way from the United States. Thousands of troops and hundreds of planes are being dispatched. The exact time of arrival of reinforcements is unknown, as they will have to fight their way through Japanese attempts against them. It is imperative that our troops hold until reinforcements arrive." The general and his men would see no ships or troops, except for a trickle of supplies and ammunition brought to Corregidor by submarine, the same vehicle MacArthur later used for his escape to Australia. No help got through to the beleaguered enemy. The Imperial Navy had unchallenged control of all waters where it operated in March and April, and the Imperial Army was rapidly securing control of all land masses. Tulagi and Guadalcanal were seized in May, a few weeks after Nagumo's planes made the first attack an aircraft carrier ever made on another. His far-ranging Sea Eagles buried HMS Hermes under a hail of steel in minutes, just as they had the British cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall. By the time spring came to Japan, that soft season when cherry blossoms, sakura, bloom first in the south, then creep northward and spread a pink and white blanket over my beloved homeland, the combined fleet was ready to rest on its oars for a while. Nearly all warships were home or headed home for refit, the carriers to obtain new planes and pilots to replace losses, the rest to get an overhaul in preparation for our next move. No one knew just what it would be, not even the members of our high command. They were arguing hotly about it, and would for weeks before a decision was reached. Then a man in the United States, whose name has been forgotten by most Americans and is unknown to nearly all Japanese, got an idea. He was Captain Francis S. Lowe, USN. Another man would take the lead in carrying it out. He is much better known to Americans and Japanese. His name is James Doolittle. Chapter 5. Victory via Midway? Once the first great flush of victory had passed, Japan's military leaders had to decide what to do next. So far, everything had gone just about as planned. Although we had, in the first 4 months of war, lost some planes and airmen that would not be easily replaced, we still had a mighty aircraft carrier force completely intact. Our battleships had not a scratch on them, chiefly because most of them rode serenely at anchor off Kure, while our other warships carried Japan's war effort 1/3 of the distance around the world. New submarines, destroyers, and aircraft carriers were coming off the ways too, but at nothing like the rate our leaders knew America could produce them. So Japan could not afford to sit still, waiting for the enemy to gain strength and assault us. Already his aircraft carriers had begun nibbling at our outposts. No nation ever won a war of expansion by pausing for long breaths between victories. Japan would have to consolidate her holdings and seek out and destroy any force that might be used against them. There were several schools of thought among the men responsible for Japan's strategy. One group wanted to push westward into India and perhaps link up with a German-Italian thrust across Africa and southeastern Europe. Another group wanted to keep pushing straight southward and seize Australia, the most logical base for a land offensive against the areas we had taken. This second group wanted to deny a great training ground to the Americans, who could build military, naval, supply, and air bases in Australia. The third group, the one that finally got its way, was centered about Adem, Yamato. Very much mindful of the 5 battleships sunk by our naval air forces at Pearl Harbor and the 2 sunk off Malaya, these men had been keeping a close eye on American carrier operations. These planners had an abundance of proof of what naval aircraft could accomplish, and felt that Japan's holdings could not be protected unless the American aircraft carriers were destroyed before they were joined by 2 or 3 times their number from busy American shipyards. It had not gone unnoticed in Tokyo that America had been gearing its industry to war for more than 2 years. Her effort to assist Great Britain had helped all sectors of American industry recover from a national depression. Much of America's unemployed found jobs in its expanding defense works, including shipbuilding. In spite of what many writers have said on the subject, the US was very much ready for war, at least industrially, on Date 7, 1941. Then our attack on Pearl Harbor unified what had been a divided national spirit. The citizenry was welded into a common effort to seek revenge. Japan could only win this war by working herself into such a position of strength that a negotiated peace would appear to be a better alternative to Americans than a bloody fight for many years in the Pacific. We needed another mighty victory like Pearl Harbor. What was left of US naval power had to be destroyed in one decisive battle. Adem. Yamato and those who agreed with him decided that a thrust to the east ought to be made. Target would be Midway Island, less than 1,500 miles from Pearl Harbor. If Midway fell into Japanese hands, the US would be delayed for years in mounting a Pacific offensive. Hawaii itself might fall. The Oceanic War would then become a stalemate, with Japanese naval power blocking any move westward. So, a move on Midway was bound to make the American Navy come out and fight. In that case, Yamato was sure it would be utterly defeated. The internal struggle that took place among our war planners when Midway was suggested as next objective has been adequately covered by other writers, so I will not till ploughed ground. Suffice it to say that the I operation, as it was called, finally won approval. Opposition still continued, though, while details were being discussed. Officers who were responsible for fuel supplies, replacement aircraft, provisions, supplies, and ammunition for the 5,000 troops needed to take and hold this island, kept producing statistics to show that this thrust to the east would strain Japan's resources to the limit and beyond it. They might have had their way, had not Capt. Francis Lowe suggested to Adem, Ernest King, that an attack on Japan proper might do wonders for American morale, while at the same time pushing us off balance. King agreed, and a plan was drawn up to use an aircraft carrier for this purpose. In order to drop as many bombs on Japan as possible, the US decided to experiment with some of its medium bombers, hoping that they could be flown from aircraft carriers. They called upon a former stunt pilot, Lieutenant Cole James Doolittle, to lead this effort. He did, to a success. A force of North American B-25 Mitchell bombers, named for a man who, interestingly enough, had predicted a war between Japan and the United States years before, suddenly appeared in our skies on April 18, 1942. This dramatic attack, coupled with ADE, Yamamoto's frequent earlier warnings about American aircraft carriers, turned the tide of argument as effectively as his threat to resign had done it a year before. It must be remembered that Yamamoto had been opposed to any war with America. He knew the power of America too well. He had confided to Prince Konoye that he could not guarantee any hope for success in a war after the first 6 months or year. So he advocated the surprise attack in hope of winning a major advantage with one stroke. He could lead a formidable force of surface ships plus 20 submarines in such an effort. Against the meagre strength pitted against him, these should prove overwhelming. And at Midway, he did have overwhelming odds on his side. Japanese aircraft carriers outnumbered American ones 8-3, battleships 11-0, cruisers 18-8, and destroyers 65-15. American submarine scouting strength was 15. The combined fleet sortie was to be the greatest array of sea power ever seen upon the ocean up to that time. Altogether, more than 200 ships would gather from all parts of the empire to move eastward, and submarines would also be striking to the north, south, and west. The Japanese Navy planned to strike not only at Midway, but also Australia, the Aleutians, and Diego Suarez, Madagascar, off the east coast of Africa. Our submarines were to have an important part in the struggle for Midway. First of all, they were to help repeat the K operation of early March. 2. Emily flying boats would be used, as before, but they would not carry bombs this time. Their mission was to be strictly reconnaissance. They would again take off from Vosges in the Marshalls and land at French frigate shoals. There they would refuel from mine-laying submarines I-121 and I-123, which had their mine storage areas remodelled so they could each carry 50-ton loads of aviation gasoline and oil. They would have on board teams of mechanics to service the monster flying boats at the rendezvous. Letsuda Yasuo Fujimori had I-121, and Letsuda Toshitake Ueno had I-123. The third submarine in their division was I-122. Letsuda Sadatoshi Norita would patrol the small islets in the Hawaiian chain between French frigate shoals and Midway and Her. All 3 boats were under the command of Capt. Takeharu Miyazaki. Rear Admiral Chimaki Kono had Subron 3, composed of 5 submarines. 2 of these, Lieutenant Yahachi Tanabe's I-168 and Lieutenant Katsuji Watanabe's I-169, were to patrol off Midway, reporting any enemy activity there. Lieutenant Rokuro Kawasaki's I-171, Lieutenant Toshi Kusaka's I-174, and Lieutenant Kameo Uno's I-175 would work to provide radio beacon and rescue service for the second K operation. If all went well, a pair of flying boats would be over Pearl Harbor once more. They would gather information on ships present. This would be relayed to Adiem, Yamamoto, so he could use it in his plan to smash Midway with his air strength, then take it with troops. He fully expected that the American fleet would sortie from Pearl Harbor once this had happened, knowing it could not let Japan have this key base. Yamamoto then expected to send his refueled, rearmed, and rested airmen against the American ships, while at the same time he closed with his battleships and cruisers to clean up whatever was left. Once that happened, ships would be able to ply back and forth through our defence network as safely as though they were sailing the inland sea. Nothing would be left to fight them, except a few submarines that could only operate out of Pearl Harbor, cutting radically their operation time in any combat area to a very low level. Naval planners who stood with Yamamoto even foresaw a move against Oahu itself before the end of 1942. Success there would truly make the Pacific Ocean a Japanese lake. Two other forces of submarines, meanwhile, were to strike in the south and the west. Rear Adam, Noboru Ishizaki, in his flagship I-10, commanded by Sea Dr. Yatsuchika Katahara, was to have I-16, I-18, I-20, and the new submarine I-50 with him in the Indian Ocean. They were to make a reconnaissance of the African coastline, and they were also to make an air reconnaissance of Diego Suarez, a former French base that British forces had taken over. They were also to launch a midget submarine attack at Diego Suarez at the end of May. Far to the east of Ishizaki's group were 5 more boats, I-21, I-22, I-24, I-27 and I-29. The last 2 were brand new boats. It was their task to make a similar air reconnaissance of Sydney, Australia, and also carry out a midget submarine attack. Our High Command believed that these 2 assaults would help unsettle the enemy and keep him relatively in the dark as to the combined fleet's true intentions. The attack on Midway would be brought off in such a manner as would jar American forces into immediate retaliatory action, which, of course, Yamamoto wanted to see happen. There was another diversionary operation also worked into the Midway plan. A strong northern force was to seize Attu and Kiska in the Aleutian Islands. Scouting there for it were Sea Dr. Meiji Tagami in I-25 and Sea Dr. Minoru Yokota in I-26. I-9, I-15, I-17 and I-19 were scheduled for the Aleutians too. The first 3 were to send off planes for reconnaissance flights, then move on to the south, leaving only I-19 in the north as a sentry on patrol. The trio would then form one of 3 sentry lines, deployed so as to provide warning of any American force approaching from the US mainland. These 3 sentry lines were actually the real core of the entire Midway operation. Added to the K operation, their task was to provide advance information of any US naval movement so that Yamamoto's ships could deal with it. All 3 lines were to be in place 5 days before X-Day, which was set for June 5th, Japan time. I-9, I-15 and I-17 were to station themselves on a north-south line far to the northeast of Midway, some 1,000 miles off the American west coast. They would watch for anything coming down from the north or from the northwest coast of the US. I-168 and I-169 were to scout off Midway Island and then move southeastward. They would take positions with I-171, I-174 and I-175 after these submarines had carried out their portions of the K operation. The Hawaiian chain of islands falls away in a generally southeastern direction from Midway, and ships approaching Midway from Oahu would have to come alongside one side or the other of the chain. The 5 submarines of Subron 3 would be somewhat south of French frigate shoals, lined up north to south. It would be their task to report, intercept and attack any forces coming up the southern side of the island chain. The 3rd patrol was to consist of 8 submarines under Subron 5 Commander Rear Adm. Tadashige Daigo. They were to station themselves about 900 miles due east of Midway, in position across the path any force had to take when proceeding from Oahu to Midway along the northern side of the island chain. They held the key role in the plans for the Midway battle. To the uneducated eye, viewing a chart of the mid-Pacific, the deployment of submarines in the Midway campaign probably seems excellent. Diversions as much as 5,000 miles away might help throw the enemy off the scent. Then, using the poor weather of the North Pacific to advantage, our aircraft carriers would race in from the north undetected, as they did at Pearl Harbor, and numb Midway's garrison into helplessness with one mighty blow. After that, our invasion force would come from the west, taking the island without trouble once its air defence was wiped out. At the same time, behind the carriers to the north of Midway, a massive battleship cruiser group would start moving down to back up the aircraft carriers that had never yet encountered difficulty in carrying out assigned missions. When the remnant of the American fleet hiding at Oahu came out to counterattack, it would be sent to the bottom by our planes, cruisers, and battleships. There was only one way the American Navy could thwart this grand plan, by keeping its naval air strength intact and hidden until some kind of opportunity came to strike hard and fast. Besides a great deal of skill, the American Navy would also need a great deal of luck to prevail against the particularly that of a submariner. It appeared far different. Sea Dr. Shojiro Yura, a member of the Naval General Staff, was an advisor on submarine affairs. Here is what he told me about the planning for Midway. Shortly after I assumed my post on the Naval General Staff in March 1942, one of Admiral Yamamoto's staff officers, Captain Yasuji Watanabe, arrived in Tokyo with a rough plan for the attack on Midway. It had been worked out in tabletop maneuvers on board the new super battleship Yamato at Kure and approved by Admiral Yamamoto. Captain Watanabe was relaying an urgent request from the Commander-in-Chief that the plan be given full approval by the Naval General Staff as quickly as possible. Captain Sadatoshi Tomioka, in the General Staff's operations section, was responsible for carrying out plans once they were approved. He opposed the operation. His stand reflected the prevailing opinion among the General Staff at that time, which was that the Americans should be lured into one decisive battle but not in the vicinity of Midway. Most members preferred an attack on the Fiji's arid Samoa, which were along the US to Australia supply route. The American fleet could tolerate an attack less there than on Midway, they felt. It would have to counterattack. The difference was that in the Fiji's Samoa area, the Americans would be very far from any reinforcement or assistance. The Japanese preponderance in naval strength would count for even more in such a case. These people felt that the most favourable point of attack should be the first consideration, because Midway, or any other base like New Caledonia, could be taken with ease once the American fleet was wiped out. The primary objective, they said, was the elimination of the enemy fleet at the minimum cost to our own. This could be more easily done the further the Americans were from their major base, Pearl Harbor. Yura also told me how Captain Kameto Kuroshima, operations staff officer for Yamamoto, argued with Captain Tomioka. The Midway plan must be approved, Kuroshima insisted, and cited the danger Japan faced from aircraft carriers if she did not eliminate them. "No," said Tomioka, his anger also rising. "Even if we are successful, look at the great difficulty we would have keeping Midway supplied." Japan's merchant fleet, though large, still was barely sufficient to support operations already going on in the south. The bulk of it was employed in transporting oil, rubber, tin, tungsten, and other strategic materials back to our industrial complex. Very few ships could be spared from the task of strengthening our defence through homeland construction of war instruments to provide follow-up support of a Midway operation, Tomioka noted. Capt. Tomioka and Capt. Watanabe were already in total agreement on the major point that the American fleet must be lured into battle. After heavy argument, reluctant approval was given to go ahead with general planning for the attack on Midway. Not long after that, a detailed operations plan was drafted by Yamamoto's staff and sent to Tokyo for final approval. Once this was given, the final preparations would begin. At this point, Rear Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, Tomioka's senior in the operations section, had to give approval. Sea Dr. Iura read the detailed plan as soon as it arrived and was on hand to advise Admiral Fukudome. He noted that Subron 5 was included, and this was the focal point of his objections to the Midway plan. "I cannot agree or recommend the use of that squadron in the task it has been given," Iura told Fukudome. "Those submarines are too old and too slow for that mission." Subron 5 was under Rear Adm. Tadashige Daigo, and was at that moment in Japan undergoing overhaul and repair. Most of these obsolescent boats were supposed to go into the reserve fleet on training duty. Everyone was at least a dozen years old. None could dive safely past 200 feet. "The main core of the American fleet in Hawaii," said Sir Dr. Ura, "will be composed of aircraft carriers. The old submarines of Subron 5 cannot cope with air attacks and patrols. They cannot carry out reconnaissance against such a foe, nor can they attack aircraft with any hope of success. I realize, of course, that every available warship must be committed to this operation. But I think the combined fleet staff officers are taking too much for granted when they station such a worn-out group of submarines in the path the Americans are most likely to use." Ura's arguments did not prevail. The I-Operation detailed plan was approved, unchanged so far as use of submarines was concerned. Ura would later have the satisfaction of being able to say, "I told you so." But it would be poor satisfaction. Yamamoto's plan to move against Midway, lure out the American fleet, and destroy it was given the green light. All submarine commanders began making preparations to carry out their tasks, unaware that US intelligence experts had broken the Japanese Naval Code. The Americans had a vast amount of information about our intentions. From this, they built a mosaic of our plans for ADM, Chester Nimitz in his hilltop headquarters above Pearl Harbor. Yet even if the Americans had not broken our code, I am not surprised that they learned of our intentions, or at least that they knew Midway would be the next point of attack. Our security was awful. The talk at Cure, where I was about halfway through the course for submarine commanders, was all about Midway. It was on everyone's lips. "Next time we meet," one submarine crew member would call out to a friend on the one moored abreast of his, "we will meet at Midway." "If we live, that is," his friend would answer. "Of course we will be alive," the first sailor would shout back across the few feet of water. "We don't want to die before we have taken Hawaii, do we?" First of the submarines to leave home waters were those sent on scouting and midget attack missions. They departed early in May, the other submarines streaming out into the Pacific's broad blue waters for 2 weeks after that. One boat was almost sunk by USS Silversides just after leaving port, but the American submarine's commander missed his target. Captain Hanku Sasaki, who had directed the midget submarine attack against Pearl Harbor 5 months before, led submarines south along the coast of Australia. On May 29th, a plane from I-21 flew off its catapult and over the city of Sydney without running into any opposition. When pilot and crewman got back aboard, they reported 3 capital ships and numerous smaller warcraft present in Sydney Harbour. Sasaki decided he would launch a midget submarine attack within 48 hours, using the 3 midget subs he had on hand. Late Ku, who had secretly scouted the entrance to Pearl Harbor while supposedly a tourist on board the merchant ship Taiyo Maru just before the war, was pilot of I-22's midget. His crewman was Petty Officer Takeshi Omori. I-22 was Sasaki's flagship as before, with Sita Kiyotake Agata still its skipper. I-24's midget pilot was Leto Tas J.G. Katsuhisa Ban, his crewman, Petty Officer Mamoru Ashibe. Sea Doctor Hiroshi Hanabusa still had the boat, but he had lost Lieutenant Mochitsura Hashimoto, who was with me at the Kure school. I-27, completed at Sasebo 3 months before setting out on this mission, was captained by Sea Doctor Iwao Yoshimura. His midget pilot was Lieutenant Kenshi Chuman, with Petty Officer Masao Takenaka as crewman. Cap. Sasaki manoeuvred all boats into position on May 31st and, about 4:30 p.m., began sending off his midgets. Launching point was about 7 miles off Sydney Harbour. Pilots were ordered to penetrate the anchorage, wait on the bottom until dark, then come up to periscope depth and make their attacks. Each had 2 torpedoes. A post-war check showed that one of our midgets did not penetrate the harbour. It either suffered some kind of malfunction or became entangled in anti-submarine nets. It was never seen or heard from after leaving its mothership. The other 2 got into the harbour, having made their way up a difficult winding channel. They were detected on the way in by sound equipment the Australians were using for just such kind of protection. It was nearly 11 p.m. when one of these 2 midgets was sighted from USS Chicago, a cruiser. About 2 hours later, Chicago's lookouts saw a torpedo heading their way. It missed the cruiser, a destroyer and a Dutch submarine, but hit a hotel ship, HMAS Kutabul, sinking it and killing some men on board it. A second torpedo was found run up on the shore next day. That pilot had bad luck, his torpedo missing the cruiser ahead of its bow. The big ship was missed both fore and aft. There are varying foreign versions of what happened to our midgets at Sydney. None can be correct because all state that 4 midget submarines were launched. They agree that 2 got inside Sydney Harbour because both were found on the bottom by Allied divers. One had not yet fired its torpedoes. Capt. Sasaki's young men had missed their chance to get both USS Chicago and HMS Canberra. Captain Sasaki waited off Sydney for 2 days, hoping to pick up his pilots and their crewmen, giving up only when the midget's endurance time had expired. The Battle of Sydney ended with Sea Doctor Hanabusa's gun crew loosing several rounds at the Australian city, which was immediately blacked out. I-24 then dived quickly and fled, while Capt. Sasaki was leading his 5 submarines down the east coast of Australia, Rear Adm. Ishizaki in I-8 was off the east coast of Africa. I-10's aircraft was sent over Diego Suarez on May 30th, and the Admiral ordered a midget attack made the next night. I-18's midget could not be sent off because of a breakdown of its engine, due no doubt to the fact that this sub had been cruising for about a month before the day of attack came. So only 2 midgets could be sent into Diego Suarez, where a battleship of the Queen Elizabeth class, several cruisers, and many smaller vessels lay at anchor. Sea Doctor Kaoru Yamada launched ENS, Katsusuke Iwase, from I-16, with Petty Officer Kozo Takada as crewman. Sea Takashi Yamada sent Lite Saburo Akeda away from I-20, with Petty Officer Masami Takemoto. Akeda had been waiting 4 years for this chance. He had been a pioneer midget pilot with Lart Naoji Iwasa in 1938, when the weapon had proved itself well enough to gain approval for mass production. Akeda had also played an important role in training in the Koryu, the inland sea. These young lads, the cream of young Japanese manhood, thought very highly of themselves and their weapon. They were not organized as a Toko cause, were never meant to be suicide pilots. Still, they had a streak of fatalism in them, as testimonials left behind them show. Off Pearl Harbor, Lit Iwasa had written the words Shisei, utmost loyalty, with brush and ink on rice paper as a memento for I-22's crewmen. He and many other midget submariners never truly expected to return alive from missions, though some did during the Solomons campaign. All faced danger cheerfully and fearlessly. The attack on Diego Suarez was very successful. The battleship HMS Warspite was hit and badly damaged. She retreated quickly to Durban, South Africa, and posed no threat to our Indian Ocean forces for quite a while. An enemy tanker was also sunk. A reconnaissance flight over Diego Suarez from one of the submarines after the attack found the battleship missing from her mooring place, and at first our High Command concluded that she had been sunk. The truth was learned later through careful monitoring of enemy broadcasts. From these same broadcasts, it was learned that 2 Japanese men, possibly Akeda and Takemoto, had gotten ashore after the battle and tried to attack the shore garrison. They continued to charge after being ordered to surrender and were killed. The submarines waited in vain for midgets to return. Letertata Ueno took the fuel-laden I-123 out and slipped right up to the edge of French frigate shoals from Kwajalein without any trouble, arriving outside the reef on May 26th. But when he peered through his periscope, he received a terrible shock. There, in the lagoon, was an American ship. It was identified as a small seaplane tender. Certainly no flying boats could land at French frigate shoals now. Nor could I-123 try to torpedo this barrier to the K operation either. Even one radio message, gotten away before the enemy sank, might reveal the plan. Captain Ueno decided that the thing to do was to wait and watch. That is what he did, for most of 5 days. Then, with time running out and the enemy showing no sign of moving, he finally sent off a wireless message to Vice Adm. Komatsu in his flagship Katori at Kwajalein. "The enemy's watch is intense," it read. "There appears to be no chance of carrying out the K operation." This word, relayed to Adam Yamamoto, caused cancellation of the planned air reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor. The Midway battle would have to start with no information about what ships the enemy had at Pearl Harbor, the most important base from which a strike against our forces could be dispatched. The first thing that could go wrong with our Midway operation had now gone wrong. Other things were to follow. Seidyota Shojiro Yura, representing our submarine fleet at Tokyo, had shown great foresight by protesting the use of Subron 5 boats, all obsolescent, in the Midway operation. He predicted that they would not be able to do the jobs given them. He proved to be very, very correct. These 8 old boats, under Rear Adm Tadashige Daigo, who used Rio de Janeiro Maru at Kwajalein for his flagship, had done some good work in the early operations to our south. I-156 had pinpointed the position of HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse for the Mihoro, Genzan and Kanoya Naval Air Corps, which lost no time finding them and blasting them into extinction. All boats had later operated extensively with the fleet in those waters, for a period longer than should have reasonably been expected of them, before returning to Japan for overhaul. It takes far more effort to put an older warship back into battle condition than it does a new one. The submarines of Subron 5 proved no exception to this axiom. Work on them took so long that they did not get clear of Japanese waters until well past their scheduled date. Then, after stopping at Kwajalein to refuel, they still had 2,000 miles to go before reaching the posts assigned them on the patrol line. Much of this distance had to be travelled underwater, at slow speeds, to avoid detection by the long-range Catalina patrol bombers operating out of Midway. This wasted even more time. Entirely too much credit for the American victory at Midway, and it was truly a great naval victory, won by brave and daring men, has been given to the fact that the Americans had broken our code and could read our messages almost as fast as our radio operators could. All that did was tell the Americans where we were going to attack and let them know how overwhelming was the force being sent against them. Edm. Nimitz deduced the place of attack by a simple ruse. Thinking it might be Midway, he told the commander of that island to send him a message, in plain language, telling him it was having trouble desalting water. We had been calling Midway Island F in our messages, and when his intelligence men decoded our message saying that Island F was experiencing a breakdown in its water supply, Nimitz had final confirmation of our destination. He still, however, had a much greater problem than merely knowing where we were going. How was he to defeat a force of more than 100 surface warships when he could muster only a little more than 24 to send against them? One of his ships, USS Yorktown, got into battle only because hordes of naval shipyard workers at Pearl Harbor, many of them the sons or grandsons of men born in Japan, swarmed over the big aircraft carrier, and did a hurry-up job that let her go off to battle in spite of severe damage suffered a few weeks before at Coral Sea. Knowing we were going to attack Midway and having a pretty good idea of when, ADML. Nimitz planned to station all of his available surface forces at sea off our left flank. They would be given orders to make an all-out attack on our aircraft carriers as soon as these were identified and located. Like Yamamoto, Nimitz greatly feared his enemy's naval air power, so he pinned all of his hopes on sinking as many of our aircraft carriers as he could. He positioned his striking force well to the northeast of Midway, where they were to hide and wait for the time of greatest opportunity. Nimitz knew he was sending his ships and men on an almost suicide mission. Should they encounter our surface fleet, they wouldn't have a chance. All of his hopes rested on 2 things. His very long-range patrol planes based on Midway had to locate our aircraft carriers, while his own carriers stayed out of range of the shorter-range planes we could send searching for them from our carriers. Then his carriers might be able to race in and attack ours with their aircraft. They got their chance chiefly because of the way Subron 5 and other boats of the Sixth Fleet were employed in the Midway campaign. Had our submarines been used properly and effectively, the history of the Pacific Naval War might have been written quite differently. Chapter 6. Defeat at Midway. The submarines heading for the Midway operation began leaving Japan on May 10, 1942. They kept streaming out of Tokyo Bay and from Bungo Strait, the water passage separating the islands of Honshu, Kyushu and Shikoku from one another, for 2 weeks after that. Subron 5, the vital sentry line group of submarines so important in the battle because it was supposed to provide us any knowledge of the enemy nearing our aircraft carriers, was in 2 divisions. Captain Ryojiro Ono had 4 boats. These were I-156 under Lieutenant Kader Katsuo Ohashi, I-157 under Lieutenant Sakae Nakajima, I-158 under Keta Sochichi Kitamura, and I-159 under Lieutenant Kader Tamori Yoshimatsu. Advance notice of the poor fortune Subron 5 would experience was given on May 17th, just after some of the submarines had cleared Bungo Strait. Lieutenant Satoyoshi Niina had barely brought his boat around toward the east after exiting the passage and was cruising serenely on the surface, well within range of protective air bases, when the USS Triton, which had been cruising in waters south of Kyushu, spied it. With 1 torpedo, Triton sent I-164 to the bottom. The American submarine did not stop to pick up any of the survivors. We suffered another submarine loss that day, but it was a boat playing no part in the Midway operation. She was I-28, only 3 months off the shipways, and had left Truk on April 30th to participate in the Coral Sea battle. On May 11th, the battle over, I-28 was ordered back to Truk. On May 16th, she reported by wireless that she was 250 miles north of Rabaul and having engine trouble. The American submarine Tautog surprised her the next day. Sea Doctor Yasuo Yajima went down with his submarine and crew. If, as American sources claim, Tautog had also sunk I-23 3 weeks before off Oahu, she was indeed proving herself to be a powerful enemy. On May 27th, the Japanese Navy Day, because it is the anniversary of Adam Heihachiro Togo's great victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, the bulk of our surface forces departed Japanese waters. The Northern Force, under Vice Adm. Moshiro Hosogaya, headed for the Aleutians. Hosogaya had under him a carrier striking force, invasion troops for Attu and Kiska, and the submarines of Rear Adm. Yamazaki. The Midway invasion force moved out from the Marianas under Vice Adm. Nobutake Kondo. He also had auxiliary ships with him, and his force of 15 troop transports was protected by the world's greatest torpedo tactician, Rear Adm. Raizo Tanaka. Tanaka would become chief engineer of what the Americans called the Tokyo Express in the Solomons a few months later. They would nickname him Tenacious. Tanaka because of his aggressive spirit, and he was also called the Japanese Arleigh Burke. Some students of naval warfare like to ponder Tanaka and Burke in the same way American boxing fans speculate about Jack Dempsey and Joe Louis, both former world's heavyweight boxing champions. They try to imagine what it would be like if those men met each other in a match while each was at the peak of his prowess. The torpedo tactics of both Tanaka and Burke are studied by destroyermen for the battles of Cape St. George and Tassafaronga during the struggle for the Solomons. Tanaka had been transferred to a shore station in Burma by the time Burke got into the Pacific theatre of war. It would have been interesting had these 2 great fighters met in sea combat, but it is perhaps fortunate they never did. One or both might have died facing each other. The carrier striking force that was to immobilize Midway Island and soften it up for invasion was centered around Kaga, Akagi, Hiryu, and Soryu, under Vice Adm. Chuichi Nagumo. He had led these 4 flat tops, plus Shokaku and Zuikaku, against Pearl Harbor in December, but Shokaku had been heavily damaged in the Coral Sea battle 2 weeks earlier, and Zuikaku had lost aircraft and men that could not be replaced in time to let her join Nagumo's forces. Another of the earlier objections by Naval General Staff members to the Midway Plan, that replacement of aircraft and airmen was a critical problem, had been proven. Still, Admiral Yamato, steaming to sea with the main body in the tradition of a sea leader accompanying his ships, was full of confidence. The force around his flagship Yamato included 2 other battleships, a light aircraft carrier, a light cruiser, and 9 destroyers. He also had with him Chiyoda and Sishin, still listed as seaplane carriers, but actually having on board 24 midget submarines. After Midway was taken, these were to be put ashore to help defend the island. The plan for use of submarines extended well past the Battle of Midway. Once 6th Fleet had been committed to it, planners started work on what would follow this great victory. The policy set down after our poor showing at Pearl Harbor that submarines would operate chiefly against merchant vessels rather than against warships was adjusted to follow up on the Midway operation. A victory in mid-Pacific would leave the great might of our combined fleet barring the way across an ocean bereft of American naval power. Few ships would be able to supply Australia or fight against us. The airbase to be built on Guadalcanal, in the southeastern Solomons, would help our ships keep watch on the US-Australia route. So would a seaplane base to be established at Tulagi, just north of Guadalcanal. Air and surface operations would meet no opposition if the High Command later wanted to take New Caledonia, Fiji, Samoa, the New Hebrides, or any other place. Strength in the Central Pacific would free our submarines for other operations in other areas. We intended to use nearly all we had in the Indian Ocean. Our best submarines would be employed in one massive blockade. So submarine commanders operating in the Midway, US West Coast, and Aleutians areas were ordered to put about after Midway was taken, and to take up stations off Australia and in the Indian Ocean. We had an excellent base at Penang, Sumatra, from which the Indian Ocean submarines could operate in 2 groups. One of these would shut off the exit areas from the Suez Canal, through which ships were coming in an effort to build up Allied strength in India. In concert with German submarines, these and another group of Japanese submarines would block supplies moving to Australia and India via the Cape of Good Hope. You can see from the above how much depended on success at Midway, but this dream would never be realized, chiefly because the use of our submarines in the Midway operation was so poor. Perhaps Combined Fleet had a low opinion of submarines, which had not sunk many enemy ships in the war's first months. I shall only summarize the main action of the battle for Midway here. Nagumo's carriers moved in and made their attack on the island. American planes there, forewarned by patrol planes, took to the air before Nagumo's airstrike arrived and landed after it left. Then the American land-based planes took off again, this time to strike at our aircraft carriers. Our ship's gunners and combat air patrol shot nearly every one of these attackers out of the sky. Nagumo's air officers, meanwhile, had advised him that another airstrike on Midway was necessary. At that time he had a force of torpedo planes in reserve on board Kaga and Akagi, plus an airstrike force ready on Hiryu and Soryu. He quickly rearmed all returning planes so that they could join in a massive airstrike against an enemy sea force. He could have completely destroyed the American carrier force, which had not yet been found by his ship-based patrol craft. But when he came under attack from Midway aircraft, Nagumo decided to hit the island a second time, to destroy this threat from land. He ordered the torpedo planes to be struck below decks, so they could rearm with bombs for this purpose. Note, we had planes that could serve double duty as torpedo or level bombers. The Americans did not. Nagumo's force was in this vulnerable condition, with his cover of fighter planes down near the surface, beating off attackers from Midway, and with torpedoes and bombs lying loose around the hangar decks of Kaga and Akagi, when enemy dive bombers suddenly appeared overhead. In a very short time, 3 of his 4 carriers were practically destroyed, with the 4th getting a fatal blow not long afterward. By the next day at noon, Kaga, Akagi, Hiryu and Soryu were at the bottom of the sea. The only real damage done to the Americans in exchange for this horrendous loss was 2 bomb hits and 2 torpedo hits on the U.S. aircraft carrier Yorktown. Adem. Yamamoto, with his heavy ships, raced rapidly toward Midway, hoping to catch the American carriers during the night and sink them, but he turned back after some hours on this course. The American carriers, on the other hand, steamed westward for a while, then wisely retreated to the east. Our invasion force had to be turned around too, now that it had no air cover. Yamamoto eventually had to turn his entire fleet around and head back for Japan. Just as Admiral Nimitz hoped, the flanking force of American aircraft carriers had been able to get into position northeast of Midway and wait. The American aircraft carriers were able to reach their hiding positions safely and remain undetected there because the sentry line of Subron 5 arrived on station too late. Japanese submarines enjoyed only one bright moment at Midway, and that came 2 days after the main battle was over. When 3 of our carriers were put out of action within minutes, the 4th one was a little to the north and escaped that first blow. She was Hiryu, which managed to get off 2 small strikes against the American task force. Hiryu's pilots bored in and crippled the Yorktown, suffering the loss of 2/3 of their number in the attack. Those that got back reported 1 American carrier hit and burning. At that time, Lieutenant Yahachi Tanabe was off Midway, within visual range of the island. He had been watching it for 4 days, through his periscope by day and with binoculars at night. His I-168 sent off the early reports of heavy activity by American patrol bombers based on Midway. It also had a front-row seat for our air attack on the island. Early on June 5th, when Yamamoto was still speeding in with his main body, Tanabe was ordered to shell Midway and was told he would be joined by our 4 heavy cruisers racing in from the west. Tanabe was spotted as soon as he surfaced and had to dive quickly. Later that morning, after scout planes from Nagumo's force again sighted Yorktown, they reported her as being dead in the water, about 150 miles northeast of Midway. A message was sent out at once. I-168 will locate and sink the American carrier. Tanabe set off at once, cruising submerged until the sun had set. Then, he said, we ran on the surface for a while, but not at top speed because I was afraid we might miss the enemy in the blackness. It was 5:30 in the morning when one of my lookouts sighted the enemy carrier. She was a big shape on the horizon about 12 miles away. I-168's crew leaped to their battle stations. "Stand by to dive!" shouted Tanabe. "Come right to the new course, 045! Dive!" After he was inside his submarine's hull, he ordered, "Level off at 90 feet, slow to 6 knots." 6 nerve-stretching hours followed while I-168, slowed almost to a creep, worked her way into attack position. She eased off on her engines until her screws were barely making 3 knots. Every 30 minutes, Tanabe brought I-168 up to periscope depth so he could take a quick look at the situation. His periscope was never up for more than 5 seconds, but he was able to get a clear impression of what was happening. One ship, which he thought to be a destroyer, had the aircraft carrier in tow. He could see 3 more destroyers, so he assumed that there were at least 2 more on the carrier's other side, patrolling against submarines. The destroyers were about 1 mile out from the carrier, which convinced Tanabe that if he got off a shot at the carrier, they would surely sink his boat in the counterattack. Still, he pressed on. That aircraft carrier was too important a prize to let escape. He changed course a few degrees to the right from time to time, having noticed that the Yorktown was making some headway under her tow and moving east. I-168's sound man told his captain that the American destroyers were operating their sound equipment. But a little after 11 a.m., their pinging could no longer be heard. This puzzled Tanabe, but he kept his voice light as he told his crew. The Americans seem to have interrupted their war for lunch, and a crew member answered, "We shall give them some torpedoes for dessert." The next time Tanabe put up his periscope for a quick sweep, he found himself inside the destroyer screen. 2 destroyers were abaft his beam, one about 1,000 yards to starboard, the other an equal distance to port. He was now heading straight for the carrier's centre and should have given the order, "Make ready to fire!" Instead, he stunned his crew by calling out, "Down periscope, right 20 degrees rudder." Tanabe's men must have thought he'd gone mad, but they obeyed his orders even before he began an explanation for his actions. I-168's captain had been so intent on getting safely past the American escort ships that he had actually let himself get too close to the Yorktown. Now he was afraid that the run of his torpedoes would be too short to arm them, since it took several hundred yards to do that. What he had to do was make a complete circle and get back on his original track, but he wanted to end up further away from the carrier when his circle was completed, so he eased off the rudder as I-168 started to come around. The submarine made a wide circle, taking about an hour to do so, while her crew, in bare feet or thin cotton slippers, kept near total silence. I-168's periscope did not again appear above the surface until she was almost back on her original approach course. While he waited, Tanabe outlined a special plan to his torpedo officer. I-168 at that time did not mount the giant Model 95 torpedoes with their 890 lb warheads. Tanabe's boat was armed with Model 89s, whose warheads carried only 649 pounds of explosive. He had an idea, as he put it, for making 95s out of my 89s. The usual spread for torpedoes was 2 or 3 degrees between their paths. Should I-168 fire a full salvo from her 4 forward tubes, the total spread would be 9 degrees. But I wanted to concentrate my punch in the carrier's centre, he said, rather than spread it out along her hull, so I planned to fire my torpedoes in pairs, with a 2-degree spread for each pair. Furthermore, I planned to fire tubes 1 and 2 first, then send torpedoes from tubes 3 and 4 right behind them, in their wakes. If all went well, those 4 torpedoes would hit very close together and do the maximum possible damage to the enemy ship. By 1 p.m. of June 6th, Tanabe was squared away on his original track, but the American destroyers appeared to have no knowledge of his presence. I have since read that a thick blanket of oil, seeping from the damaged flat top, may have affected the performance of enemy sound equipment, rendering it practically useless. Ready to fire, Tanabe began to plan his escape after the attack. The wakes of his torpedoes, which were not of the oxygen-propelled type and therefore could be easily seen, would reveal his position. Men on board the carrier would know at once where they came from, though it would do them little good by that time. He called out, "Fire!" and the torpedoes raced out ahead of him while he kept his periscope above the water to observe their results. Nearly a full minute passed before the first torpedo struck. "A hit!" Tanabe shouted, and someone else in the conning tower responded with, "Banzai!" Others called out, "We did it! We did it!" as they heard more explosions follow the first one. "Go ahead at full speed," ordered Tanabe. "Dive to 200 feet." The submarine lurched forward and downward, and Tanabe soon called out, "Slow to 3 knots." He planned to get squarely beneath the carrier if possible, then make a turn toward her stern and escape under cover of explosions above him. He had seen a 5th destroyer nestled alongside the carrier, and felt that no depth charges would be fired for fear of killing any men who might land in the water. Once below the Yorktown, Tanabe swung his rudder left and began creeping past her stern. The American destroyers were on him at once. 3 appeared to be attacking him, one holding his position on its sound equipment, while the other 2 made depth charge runs. These ships should have killed I-168, but Yahachi Tanabe led a charmed life. Each time his sound man reported an enemy ship making its run, Lieutenant Sida Tanabe would swing his boat around to a course opposite that of his attacker. Most of the time this resulted in the Americans overrunning him, all depth charges dropping into the water well aft of I-168's stern. The enemy was clever enough not to stay with one tactic for too long. 2 hours passed without much more damage done to I-168 than a good shaking up. Then one destroyer dropped a pattern of depth charges short. They exploded very near I-168's bow. "All lights went out at once," says Tanabe, "and a few seconds later my forward battery room was reporting water leaks. These could cause chlorine gas to form, killing the crew of 104, for whom Tanabe had only 10 gas masks on board. Litegunichi Mochizuki, the electrical officer, took the masks and a few crewmen and went into the battery room. His party disconnected the flooded batteries, eliminating this danger. Then word of another danger was passed from the forward torpedo room. The outer and inner doors of torpedo tube number 1 had been sprung by the blasts," he says, "and water was coming into the boat. Unless it could be stopped, I-168 would become bow-heavy, sink below her safe operating depth, and be crushed by sea pressure along with all of us in her." Crewmen finally sealed off the damaged torpedo tube with wedges, dowels, and whatever else they could lay their hands upon. The immediate danger was averted. "But we were still down by the bow because of the water we had taken aboard," says Tanabe. "So I used a tactic other submarines were to use throughout the war. I sent forward all crewmen who could be spared. Each one of them picked up a sack of rice or a box of provisions and carried it aft, going back again for another." That tactic helped Tanabe get his boat back on a fairly even keel by the time electrical power was restored. By then, I-168 had been cruising submerged for nearly 12 hours. Her batteries and air supply were low because of the manoeuvring done while dodging depth charges. She would soon have to surface to recharge batteries and to replenish her air tanks. From 3:30 in the afternoon, the depth charges had been coming down less and less often and in smaller groups. Tanabe decided that the Americans were hoarding what depth charges they had left. Actually, a few more all-out attacks might have caused I-168 to broach out of control, an easy target for gunfire. The same depth charge that had sprung her torpedo tube doors and caused flooding of battery cells had also made her surge nearly 100 feet toward the surface, temporarily helpless. Tanabe had 5 pistols and 10 rifles in his small arms locker. He issued these and ordered his deck gun crew to stand by near the conning tower so they could get on deck quickly. Sunset was not far off. If he could avoid the enemy ships for a little while longer, he hoped to surface after dark, run a while to recharge his batteries and air, then make another dive. He still had plenty of torpedoes, with 5 tubes left for firing them, and intended to make a fight of it. In the dark, he felt, his submarine might have an advantage, even though outnumbered. A long lull occurred in the enemy's fire. Tanabe decided his chance had come, his soundman having reported only very weak propeller sounds. "Surface!" he ordered, and began running west at 14 knots, the best speed I-168 could make while taking in air and recharging her batteries. Far to the east, beyond the horizon, he was sure an enemy aircraft carrier was sinking. He had seen his torpedoes strike into her and explode. Not as far to the east, however, were the 3 destroyers. They were about 6 miles astern of him, heading away from him at a good speed. 2 came about in pursuit, and a race against time began. With their superior speed, the destroyers were sure to overtake Tanabe before long. He had to stay free long enough to let his men get I-168 ready for a dive. "Make smoke!" he ordered, and a great billowing black cloud soon streamed over his stern. He used it for cover. It helped for a little while, and the first shells from the destroyers landed nowhere near him. The Americans had started shooting at a range of 4 miles, seemed too excited to shoot straight at first, perhaps because they wanted revenge so badly, but they soon became more accurate. Before long, Tanabe's boat was straddled by a salvo of shells. It was merely a matter of time until an alert gunnery officer walked, shots back and forth across him for a direct hit. That would mean the end of I-168. "I can remember the moment of that straddle most vividly," says Tanabe. "Men on deck began darting quick looks at me, their faces taut and pale. They were anxious to get back inside the hull and for I-168 to dive. Only their long training and discipline kept them at their posts, just as it kept me at mine. I could also detect a note of strain in the voices of the men below as they called up reports. Those men, intent on dials and gauges, knew we had to stay on the surface long enough to give our boat a fighting chance, but they also wanted to get beneath the surface, away from enemy guns. I held off as long as I dared, then shouted down, "Have you enough air and power for short-time operations?" "Yes," came the rapid answer. "Then stand by to dive," Tanabe yelled, ordering his gun crew and lookouts below. He followed them down the hatch and tried another ruse to fool the trailing destroyer men. He ordered the rudder put full over, reversed his course while still on the surface, and dived while heading straight at his pursuers. Because of the black smoke, they couldn't see what he was doing. As Tanabe hoped, the destroyers ran right over him, and I-168's crewmen enjoyed a few moments free of fear. The destroyers located him again after a while, but fired only a few more depth charges before breaking off their attack. The enemy faded off Tanabe's sound equipment to the east. He assumed that they had been summoned back to the carrier, possibly to help pick up survivors. In any case, his ship was spared. By carefully husbanding his fuel supplies, Tanabe was able to make it back to Kure via a northern route, heading first for Hokkaido, veering south for Yokosuka, then to Kure. He deliberately passed up the shorter trip to Truk in case the enemy was still searching for him. A great crowd awaited I-168 at Kure. Tanabe was hailed as a national hero. He was immediately given command of a new submarine, I-176, together with the privilege of handpicking the crew for it. His experiences in I-168 made him pick men with lots of factory machine experience as civilians. The wise choices he made were to save his life and his new submarine later. The battle for Midway was over. Japan had lost 4 of its first-line aircraft carriers, a heavy cruiser, 300 aircraft with most of their airmen, and 2,000 sailors. This proved to be the turning point of the war, even though the Americans also suffered very severe losses in planes and pilots, plus a carrier and a destroyer. America could never have made its assault on Guadalcanal 2 months later, had it not known that Japan's carrier air power had been sorely weakened in the June battle. When the combined fleet returned to Japan, the crews of its ships were restricted to their vessels for weeks. Even flag officers like Rear Adm. Reiso Tanaka had to remain on board, for fear that word of the awful defeat might leak out. The wounded were taken from their ships at night and secluded in hospitals with no visitors allowed. Publicly, the High Command put a bold face on things, releasing the following communiqué. Imperial General Headquarters, June 10th, 3:30 p.m. Imperial Navy units operating in the Eastern Pacific repeatedly raided Dutch Harbour and enemy key points in the Aleutians on June 4th and 5th. On June 5th, they vigorously attacked Midway Island in the centre of the Pacific, inflicting heavy losses on the American fleet and air units in that area. In effective cooperation with the Imperial Army units, the Navy has captured key points on the Aleutian Islands since June 7th. The battle in that sector is still going on. The results ascertained to date are as follows. 1. In Midway area. 1 American aircraft carrier of the Enterprise class and 1 American aircraft carrier of the Hornet class were sunk. Approximately 120 enemy planes were shot down in air battles. Military key points were blown up. 2. In Dutch Harbour area. 14 enemy planes shot down or destroyed on the ground. 1 large transport was sunk. 2 groups of petroleum and a larger hangar were caused to burst into flames. 3. Losses to the Imperial Navy were 1 aircraft carrier. Another aircraft carrier and a cruiser were badly damaged, and 35 planes have yet to return to their bases. The truth was not very long in getting out. Men could not be held on board their ships forever, and in a few weeks word spread through the fleet of our terrible losses. The news spread among the citizenry after that, but not much happened. Top officials could show that Japanese garrisons were almost everywhere. The great victory in the Philippines over an army of 100,000 men was still fresh in all minds, Corregidor having surrendered in May, and the public still believed the communique issued after the Battle of the Coral Sea. It had listed 2 American aircraft carriers, 1 American battleship and 1 destroyer as having been sunk. It also claimed heavy damage to a British battleship, an Australian heavy cruiser, and an American heavy cruiser of unidentified class. It reported that 89 enemy planes had been shot down, while admitting only the loss of a small Japanese aircraft carrier. But, so far as the Japanese public was concerned, all seemed to be going well. They continued to endure the hardship of rationing, just as they had been doing for the previous 3 years, well before the war started. They did not know that all the damage 125 Japanese warships had been able to do in the Pacific, outside of a few bombings, was sink the aircraft carrier Yorktown, destroyer Hammond, and 2 merchant ships, SS Coldbrook, 5 104 tons, and SS Coast Trader, 32 86 tons. I give Sea Dr. Minoru Yokota and I-26 credit for this last vessel, sent to the bottom off the U.S. West Coast. I will now indulge in what the Americans call Monday morning quarterbacking. After the Battle of Midway, the staff of ADM. Yamato got along much better with members of the Naval General Staff, chiefly because the defeat made Combined Fleet staff men a lot less arrogant. But Midway should have been a victory. Over 200 Japanese ships were employed in this effort. Some have written that American intelligence efforts really won the battle. This is not true. Others have put the blame on Admiral Yamamoto, saying he should have kept his vast naval strength together, crushing the Americans with it when they met. Yamamoto is blameless. He did what was right. He kept his main body in position where it could move to back up either his northern or southern forces, Aleutians or Midway, if either were attacked. American carrier admirals, who have the advantage of speaking from victories they won only when they finally outnumbered the remaining Japanese carriers, and had learned many lessons from men other than themselves, say that Yamamoto should have put his main body among his carriers, so it could provide anti-aircraft protection for them. Had this been done, they say, Nagumo's ships would not have suffered so much harm in just one dive-bombing attack. It is true that these men employed their battleships in company with their carriers, but I suggest that it might have been more because they had to, rather than that they wanted to. In the first years of the war, the Americans had to make do with what they had. It is to their credit that they refined the carrier battleship task force into a mighty weapon. Again, however, one should look at the list of ships America could use in frontline battle during 1942-43 before deciding whether battleships with carriers was an invented or a necessary development of naval warfare. Nagumo has been attacked for his indecisiveness. Of this charge, he certainly was guilty. A look at the Pearl Harbor and other attacks he led provides evidence to support this verdict. On December 7, 1941, Nagumo sent half of his air strength in and kept the other half ready for a repeat attack. This second half was also ready to attack enemy aircraft carriers, should they appear. And while the second half was over Pearl Harbor, the first half was on flight decks, arming and refueling for a strike against any naval force sighted. 4 months later, when the Nagumo force hit Colombo, Ceylon, the same tactic was used. One wave went in, while another stood by. The first wave was en route to target when scouts reported the presence of British capital ships. Without hesitation, Nagumo sent off his second wave against these new targets. It sank the British cruisers Cornwall and Dorsetshire. A few days after that, Nagumo attacked British shipping in the harbour of Trincomalee, Ceylon. Again he had a second wave ready, and again a scout reported the presence of a second force, this one including an aircraft carrier. And again, without any hesitation, Nagumo launched his second wave against a second target. Those planes sent the carrier HMS Hermes and HMS Vampire, a destroyer, to the bottom. The general impression has been that American flyers were the first to sink a carrier from a carrier, and that the Battle of the Coral Sea was the first time a battle was fought without the opposing ships coming within sight of each other. This impression is, of course, wrong. HMS Hermes, a light carrier, was sunk by Japanese flyers a full month before the Coral Sea battle, in the first such engagement. Now then, since he had twice done so earlier, why did not Nagumo send off his ready aircraft against the American ships in the Midway battle when they were first sighted? And there is a much more important question to be asked than why Yamamoto spread his strength so widely and why Nagumo hesitated. Neither question would have to be asked had the enemy been located earlier. So I ask, why were submarines not used properly in the first place, since they held the actual key to success at Midway? For the attack on Pearl Harbor, a total of 14 submarines were used in a screen. I was executive officer in one of them, I-15, cruising in line abreast with 10 other submarines, 300 miles ahead of Nagumo. 3 other submarines were just 50 miles ahead of him. Had this simple tactic been repeated during the approach to Midway, with the line of submarines swinging to the eastward on Nagumo's flank, surely some submarines would have sighted the American carriers. Sea Dr. Ura was correct, of course, in his low estimate of Subron 5's ability. Tokyo planners should have listened to him. A moderate change in plans could have sent newer and more powerful submarines out far earlier to form that sentry line between Pearl Harbor and Midway. They would have discovered the Americans lurking on Nagumo's flank, would have alerted Nagumo and probably sunk some of them too. Because it wasn't done at Midway what Yamamoto feared did happen. The enemy came in from the flank, catching our forces by surprise, and Japan lost the bulk of a naval air strength which, to that point, had been responsible for nearly all of its victories. The master plan to close off more than half of the world's waters to the enemy was wrecked, and it all happened purely because those planning the Midway assault did not give enough attention to establishing early contact with the counter-attacking force. Again and again, this lesson of poor employment of submarines at Midway would later be brought home to us. American submarines, on many occasions, reported movements of our forces early and struck at them as they passed, using the basic strategy we ourselves had been practicing for in the pre-war years. 1/3 of all Japanese warships sunk went down before the torpedoes of submarines under Vice Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of U.S. underwater forces in the Pacific. Apparently he and his staff had far less trouble convincing their seniors how submarines should best be employed in war. Except for heavy accent on how many of our merchant ships they sank in the war, the full role of American submarines against us has never been properly explained. They won the Pacific Naval War for America. Some of the Japanese submarines with the Aleutians force went on to the west coast of America after the Midway battle. I-26 shelled a Canadian telegraph station at Estewan Point, Vancouver, on June 20th. On the next day, I-25 shelled Fort Stevens, Oregon, with Sata Tagami shrewdly taking his boat in and out through a fleet of fishing boats. This made detection and pursuit of him very difficult for the enemy. The midget-carrying submarines off Sydney continued to operate in those waters and reported several sinkings. On June 1st to 8th, I-21 bombarded the city of Newcastle, Australia. It was the other group of midget carriers, however, that sent in the best news. After severely damaging a British battleship and sinking a tanker at Diego Suarez, they moved north and covered the Suez Canal exits. I-10 especially enjoyed great success. All told, these submarines sank more than 20 enemy ships in the 2 months following the Midway battle. I graduated from Submarine Commander's School at the end of June, with orders to take over command of RO-1001, a brand new medium-sized submarine. Just before I finished the course, our class received some startling news. We did not fully realize it at the time, but it was the true turning point of the war for Japan's submarine power, just as Midway was the true turning point for our naval air power. I-1, I-2, I-3, I-4, I-5, I-6 and I-7 had been dispatched from home waters to support the thrust into the Aleutians. On June 21st, while patrolling in a very thick fog which made visibility almost zero, I-5's deck watch suddenly found themselves showered by enemy shells, some of which came dangerously close to hitting their submarine. I-5's captain ordered a crash dive at once, and the sub just barely escaped annihilation. This was the first indication that the Americans had radar in their ships and could use it to control gunfire. Radar was to prove a big factor in the defeat of my country, and the most ironic thing about it is that the Americans, for all their reputation for inventiveness, got the heart of their radar from Japan. Radar was not in any kind of sense an American invention or development, since the Americans got their first assistance with radar from the British, who were reluctant at first to share this secret with their proposed allies. Dr. Hidenobu Yagi of Japan developed the Yagi antenna, whose principle was the heart of most radar sets used during World War II and later. He developed it long before World War II started, but no one in Japan attributed any military significance to Yagi's invention, thus proving the biblical saying that a prophet is not without honor except in his own country. The Japanese scientist accomplished this, mind you, nearly 10 years before the Pacific War started. During the early 30s, Dr. Yagi visited the United States, where he delivered papers on his antenna before various scientific bodies. These papers were printed in American journals. Later, enemy scientists turned his writings to their advantage to help them in refining this electronic phenomenon. Japan, on the other hand, made no great effort to produce radar. More than 2 years of conflict passed before a dependable radar set appeared on board any of our warships. So, as June 1942 ended, the general news coming to us at Kure was not good, except for the accomplishments of the Indian Ocean Submarines. Nevertheless, I was optimistic. I had enjoyed a few months of Hisako's excellent cooking and warm companionship, together with the gurgling company of my fine son, Shuichi. And before long I would board my first submarine command, something I had been looking forward to since my days at Itajima. Chapter 7. My first command, Guadalcanal assaulted. I had been looking forward to the day I took command of RO-101 to supervise her completion for more than a dozen years. I had high hopes for what I might accomplish with her because I was a Kagoshima boy. All my life I had been very aware of this. The place of my birth is where the Imperial Japanese Navy was also born. In June 1853, an American squadron under Commodore Matthew Perry docked at Uragamachi on Tokyo Bay. In September of that year, a Russian force of ships moored at Nagasaki. Japan, after nearly 240 years of self-imposed isolation, had her doors wrenched open to the world against her will. In my home city of Kagoshima at that time lived the daimyo Nariakira Shimazu, the noble whose family had ruled the southern section of Japan's southernmost main island for generations, using samurai warriors to control it. Of all our people, Lord Shimazu knew most about foreigners. Kagoshima City is in the prefecture, state, of Kagoshima, which has a long coastline and includes many small islands. Our people were hardy seafarers, who therefore had some previous contact with the outside world. Lord Shimazu at once realized that Japan would be ravaged by foreigners unless she built adequate defenses. A prediction shortly proved true by the infliction on us of unfair one-sided treaties and the bilking of us out of our gold supplies. Jokamachi, castle towns, like Kagoshima had been for nearly 700 years, might be all right for maintaining internal security, but they meant little against a sea invasion by foreigners. Shimazu at once requested permission of Shogun Hideyoshi Tokugawa's regime to build a warship for coastal defense. Receiving it, he launched a warship the next year, mounting cannon. These were tended by samurai artillerymen from among his retainers. He helped overthrow the shogun regime and restore the emperor to his throne. But Lord Shimazu also later became involved in a civil war over attitudes toward foreigners, his ships fighting a naval battle with those of the new government. Nevertheless, he holds a dear place in the hearts of Kagoshima people for his effort to bring them swiftly out of the medieval and into the modern age. He opened many schools so young people could get an education. The brighter students he sent to Tokyo, and some to Europe, for higher learning. He wanted to bring knowledge of Western civilization to our home. Because of Shimazu, a preponderance of modern Japan's educated men came from Kagoshima, although it was the poorest section, materially, of Japan. These men played important roles during the last part of the 19th century. A part of Kagoshima city near where Shimazu's castle was located is called Kajiyacho. It is a very small area, even smaller than one square block of New York City, but the samurai spirit has always been strong there. This tiny place had an impact on Japan, all out of proportion to its physical size. Among the famous men born in Kajiyacho was Takamori Saigo, Japan's first modern general. He played a leading role in the Restoration, which culminated in 1868 with the shogun overthrown and young Emperor Meiji ascending the throne to power. Prior to that, for centuries, our emperors had been figureheads, the real power being exercised by shogun, foreigner-defeating warriors, who were charged with the defense of Japan. Another famous Kajiyacho man was Iwao Oyama, who helped mold a modern army out of Japan's peasant class when the samurai were disbanded. He was senior officer in the Imperial Japanese Army during the Russo-Japanese War. A third was Toshimichi Okubo, faithful servant of the Meiji government and contributor to the first parliamentary system of rule in Japan. A fourth was Tamesada Kuroki, general in the war with Russia. A fifth was Gombe Yamamoto, who became Navy Minister during the war with Russia and was twice Prime Minister, as well as attaining the Navy rank of Admiral. And there was still another man who came from this tight cluster of homes in Kajiyacho. Still idolized in Japan, he was Heihachiro Togo, who defeated one force of Russian ships, then completely destroyed or captured a second force, sent more than halfway around the world to defeat him. His flagship at the Battle of Tsushima Strait, UN Mikasa, was restored in Yokosuka as a national shrine during the 50s. An American who greatly admired Togo was Fleet Adm. Chester W. Nimitz, USN, who lent his great name in an effort to remind our people of their great naval traditions through IJN Mikasa. Nimitz compared Togo's flagship with HMS Victory and with USS Constitution, the old Ironsides of which America is so proud.